The humidity clung to the flat, endless fields surrounding Blackwood, Ohio, a sleepy town deep in the heart of the Rust Belt where the summers felt heavy, and the air always tasted of damp earth and coming rain. It was in that gray, hazy hour before the sun truly rose that Jack Callahan began his daily ritual, his boots striking the cracked pavement with a rhythmic, military precision that echoed through the deserted streets. Jack was a man who carried the weight of his 34 years in the set of his broad, coiled shoulders, his frame honed by years of strict discipline as a Navy SEAL, though he now moved with the stiffness of a man whose wounds weren't entirely physical. His dark hair was cut short and neat, and his flint-colored eyes were in constant motion, scanning his perimeter, a habit he couldn't shake, even in this quiet civilian refuge. At his side was Kodiak, a massive German shepherd that looked more like a shadow than a dog in the dim light. Kodiak was a retired military working dog, a veteran in his own right, who bore a jagged scar across his flank and a notched left ear that gave him a permanently rugged, intimidating appearance. They were a pair of ghosts haunting the town's perimeter, watched by the locals from behind twitching curtains with a mixture of fear and suspicion. To the people of Blackwood, Jack was just the dangerous drifter who'd rented the old farmhouse on the edge of town, a man who spoke to no one and whose dog looked like it could tear apart a black bear. They didn't know about the medical leave, the sleepless nights, or the silence that was louder than gunfire in Jack's ears. The run always took them down Main Street, past the rows of shuttered shops and the single traffic light blinking yellow into the darkness, eventually leading them past the Crossroads Diner. The diner was a relic of the 50s, all chrome and humming neon, its smell of brewing coffee already seeping into the cool morning air. For the past 2 weeks, this particular stretch of the run had developed a strange, inexplicable pattern. Every morning, without fail, a small, clean styrofoam container would be sitting on the concrete step by the back kitchen door. And inside, it was always the same. 2 strips of crisp bacon and a warm, fluffy pile of scrambled eggs. No note, no name, just the food. Jack had initially treated it with the paranoia of his training, checking for poison, looking for a trap. But Kodiak had whined with a primal hunger that overrode Jack's caution. The dog had eaten it that first day and looked up at Jack with eyes that lost their combat-hardened edge for a brief moment. Now it was a ritual. But today, Jack decided to break the pattern. He didn't just want the food. He wanted the source. He stopped his run a block away, signaling Kodiak with a silent hand gesture. The dog obeyed instantly, pressing against Jack's leg, his one good ear twitching as he scented the wind. They moved quietly into the alley adjacent to the diner, melting into the shadows of the dumpster and brick walls, and waited. The chill seeped through Jack's thermal jacket, but he didn't shiver. He simply waited, a statue carved from patience and trauma. Minutes later, the heavy steel door of the diner creaked open, spilling a warm yellow rectangle of light onto the dewy asphalt. A young woman stepped out, shivering slightly in the crisp air. She looked to be about 24, her hair pulled back in a practical, messy bun that couldn't contain a few stray curls framing a face that was tired but undeniably kind. She wore a faded blue server's uniform with a white apron tied around her waist that bore the faint stains of the morning's coffee spills. This was Grace Holloway, a familiar fixture at the diner, though Jack didn't yet know her name. In her hand, she held the familiar white box. She looked left, then right, her breath pluming in white clouds before she bent down to place the food on the step. "Eat up, brave boy," she whispered to the empty air, her voice a soft melody in the harsh morning. Jack tensed, expecting Kodiak to growl. Kodiak had a deep-seated suspicion of strangers, a byproduct of his service where a stranger often meant a threat. He'd barked a mailman up a tree just last week. But as Grace stood up, Kodiak didn't growl. He didn't raise his hackles. Instead, the giant dog stepped out of the alley's darkness before Jack could issue a command. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs, his instinct to restrain his dog warring with his confusion. He watched, stunned, as Kodiak trotted right up to the young waitress. Grace gasped, taking a half step back, her hand flying to her chest. But she didn't scream. She looked down at the formidable beast, at the notched ear, the scars, and then slowly a smile bloomed on her face, one warm enough to melt the frost on the ground. "There you are," she said softly, kneeling on the grimy pavement without a second thought. "I had a feeling you'd be early." To Jack's utter disbelief, Kodiak, the dog that had taken down insurgents and sniffed out IEDs, lowered his head and nudged Grace's hand. His tail, usually held in a rigid curve, gave a slow, rhythmic thump against the brick wall. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound Jack hadn't heard in years. Grace buried her hands in Kodiak's thick fur, scratching him right behind his good ear, murmuring nonsensical words of affection. Jack stepped out of the shadows, his boots crunching on the gravel. Grace looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the tall silhouette of the man emerge from the darkness. Still, she showed no alarm. She looked at Kodiak, then up at Jack, and her smile didn't fade. It just became shy. "He's not a monster," she said, answering the town's gossip without Jack having to say a word. "He's just seen a lot of bad days." Jack looked at his dog, and then at the girl who had disarmed a weapon of war with a plate of eggs and a kind heart. For the first time since he'd arrived in Blackwood, the chill didn't feel so cold. The brass bell over the door of the Crossroads diner jingled with a cheerful urgency that was completely out of place as Jack Callahan pushed his way inside. The warmth of the interior hit him like a physical wall. The transition from the humid frost of the alley to the smell of frying bacon, old coffee, and stale cigarette smoke was jarring. He'd left Kodiak by the glass door with a command to stay, where the dog sat like a stone gargoyle, his unblinking eyes fixed on Jack's back. As the heavy door swung shut behind him, the low hum of morning conversation in the diner instantly died. It was the typical small-town reaction to an outsider, amplified by the rumors that preceded him. Every head turned. The regulars were mostly older men in flannel shirts and ball caps, retirees who had claimed the vinyl booths as their personal fiefdoms for decades. They held coffee mugs mid-air, their eyes narrowed under bushy brows, sizing up the man who lived in the farmhouse by the woods. Jack ignored them, his posture instinctively straightening into a defensive alertness. He walked toward the counter, his boots squeaking slightly on the checkered linoleum floor. Grace was behind the counter filling a sugar dispenser. When she saw him, her eyes widened and a faint blush spread across her pale cheeks. She looked different under the harsh fluorescent lights than she had in the forgiving gloom of dawn. Younger, maybe, but with shadows under her eyes that spoke of double shifts and too little sleep. Jack stopped in front of her, reaching into the pocket of his heavy canvas jacket. He pulled out a crisp $20 bill and laid it on the Formica counter. "For the food," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "For the last 2 weeks." The diner remained dead silent behind him, the tension thick enough to choke on. Grace stared at the money, then up at him, shaking her head firmly. She pushed the bill back toward him with a fingertip. "I can't take that," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "It wasn't a transaction. It was a thank you." Jack frowned, his brow furrowing. "A thank you for what? I haven't done anything." Grace leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so the prying ears in the booths couldn't catch every word. "For his service," she said, nodding toward the glass door where Kodiak kept his vigil. "And yours." Jack went rigid. "He's just a dog." Grace smiled a knowing, sad smile. "No, he's not. I saw the tattoo inside his ear," she whispered. K9451. "My brother was a handler in the Marines. He told me they tattoo the service numbers in the left ear. I saw it when he let me scratch him this morning." Jack felt a genuine jolt of shock. He'd assumed she was just a soft-hearted girl feeding a stray, but she observed with an attention to detail that rivaled his own. She'd seen the logic behind the beast. Before he could respond, the swinging doors to the kitchen burst open. A short, stout woman in her 60s emerged, wiping her hands on a stained apron. This was Brenda Kowalski, the owner of the Crossroads Diner. She had a face carved from granite, deep lines etched around a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled, and her graying hair was pulled into a severe bun so tight it stretched her temples. "Grace," she snapped, her voice like a rusty hinge. "Table 4 needs a coffee top off, and you're standing here chatting like we're at a tea party." She eyed Jack with suspicion, but then her gaze flickered to the $20 bill on the counter, and then to the girl. "And take the trash out back when you're done," she added, grumbling. Jack noticed she wasn't actually looking at the trash can. She was looking past Jack toward the dog outside. Her grumble lacked any real venom. She knew Grace was feeding the dog, and despite the scolding, she hadn't stopped it. She was a woman who guarded her heart as fiercely as her cash register. The atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile with the slam of the front door. A swirl of cold air swept through the diner, followed by a man who looked like he'd been worn down by bad choices and cheap whiskey. Mitch was a local figure Jack had seen stumbling around town before. A big man in his 40s with a beer gut straining under a grimy flannel shirt and eyes that were bloodshot from a night that hadn't yet ended. He reeked of stale liquor and aggression. "Coffee, sweetheart," Mitch boomed, lurching toward the counter and nearly knocking over a stool. He flopped onto the seat next to where Jack was standing, ignoring him completely to leer at Grace. "And make it quick, I got a headache the size of Texas." Grace's demeanor changed instantly. She shrank in on herself, her shoulders hunching. "Coming right up, Mitch," she said, her voice thin. She moved to pour the coffee, but as she set the mug down, Mitch's hand shot out, clamping around her wrist. "You're looking pretty today, Grace," he slurred, his grip tightening when she tried to pull away. How come you don't smile at me? You never smile at me. The diner went from quiet to frozen. The old men in the booth stared down at their plates, unwilling to get involved. Brenda took a step forward, her mouth open to yell. But Jack moved first. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stepped into Mitch's personal space, his movement terrifyingly fluid and controlled. Let her go, Jack said. It wasn't a request. The voice was low, devoid of anger, but heavy with a command authority that vibrated in the air. Mitch blinked, turning his bleary eyes on Jack. Who the hell are you? Mitch sneered, trying to rise to use his size to intimidate. Get lost, drifter. He didn't release Grace's wrist. Instead, he squeezed harder, making her wince. Jack moved with a speed the human eye could barely follow. His hand shot out. He grabbed Mitch's wrist, not the one holding Grace, but the other one, using it for leverage, while simultaneously applying pressure to a nerve point on the arm holding the girl. In one smooth motion, Jack twisted. It was a standard joint lock, a submission hold designed to neutralize, not permanently injure, but the pain was immediate and blinding. Mitch screamed, a high-pitched sound of disbelief, and his hand flew open, releasing Grace instantly. Jack forced Mitch down, bending the man's arm behind his back until his face was pressed against the cold laminate of the counter. I said, let her go, Jack repeated, his voice unchanged, as if he were discussing the weather. Mitch struggled, trying to fight, but Jack held him pinned with effortless strength, his hand like a steel vise. You're going to sit here, Jack said calmly, leaning close to Mitch's ear. You're going to drink your coffee in silence, and then you're going to leave. Do you understand? Mitch, rapidly sobering under the influence of pain and fear, nodded frantically against the counter. Jack released him and stepped back, smoothing his jacket. Mitch slumped onto the stool, rubbing his shoulder, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He didn't look at Grace. He didn't look at Jack. He just stared into his coffee cup, trembling. The silence in the diner was absolute. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the thick, suffocating silence of awe and fear. Every customer was staring at Jack, realizing the drifter was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Grace rubbed her wrist, looking at Jack with wide, shocked eyes, while Brenda stood with her mouth slightly agape, a dish rag clutched in her hand. Jack placed the $20 bill back on the counter, turned, and walked out the door without another word, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him as he rejoined Kodiak in the cold. Sleep was a fugitive that Jack Callahan pursued, but rarely caught. The silence of the farmhouse on the edge of Blackwood was often louder than the roar of a transport jet, filled with the ghostly echoes of battles fought in deserts thousands of miles away. When the insomnia became suffocating, usually around 0200 hours, Jack needed a mission. He needed a task to occupy his hands and quiet the static in his mind. For the past week, that mission had shifted from patrolling the perimeter of his own property to the alley behind the Crossroads Diner. He couldn't accept charity. It went against every fiber of his being, against the code of self-reliance that had been drilled into him until it was part of his marrow. Grace had refused his money, and Brenda, despite her gruff exterior, hadn't run him off. So, Jack decided to repay the debt in the only currency he had left, labor and protection. The work started with the small annoyances he'd noticed on his morning runs. A loose gutter that rattled in the wind and threatened to fall on a customer. A delivery door hinge that shrieked like a banshee every time it was opened. A rotted floorboard on the back porch step. Under the cover of night, with only the silver moonlight reflecting off the dew-covered ground, Jack worked. He moved with the silent efficiency of a phantom, his tools, a meager collection he'd brought with him, laid out on a cloth so they wouldn't clatter on the concrete. Kodiak sat nearby, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the dumpster, his ears swiveling like radar dishes to track the movements of nocturnal animals or late-night wanderers. They were a team again, operating in the darkness, but this time they were building instead of breaking. The dynamic between the soldier, the dog, and the waitress had evolved in the quiet space between night and dawn. It was unspoken. It was written in small gestures. One morning, next to Kodiak's usual container of eggs, Jack found a tall thermos. A yellow sticky note was attached to it, the handwriting loopy and cheerful. Black, no sugar, for the night watchman. P.S. The delivery door doesn't scream anymore. Thank you. Jack drank the coffee standing in the alley. It was hot, strong, and bitter, exactly how he liked it. He didn't write a note back, but the next night he fixed the flickering floodlight that had been annoying the neighbors for months. The following morning, there was a bone-shaped dog treat next to the thermos and another note. Kodiak is the best supervisor. Stay warm. It was a silent conversation, a bridge built over the chasm of his isolation. Brenda Kowalski was a tougher nut to crack. She never acknowledged him directly. Yet, on Thursday night, as Jack was tightening the bolts on a wobbly handrail, the back door opened. He froze, his hand instinctively going to his belt. But it was just the old woman. She didn't look at him. She came out with a bag of trash, dumped it in the bin, and stood there for a moment, letting the cold air hit her face. She looked at the fixed gutter, then at the stabilized railing. Without turning her head toward the shadows where she knew he stood, she spoke to the air. "That rail's been loose since '98. My husband meant to fix it before he passed. Never got around to it." She turned and went inside, the lock clicking into place. The next night when Jack arrived to work, a heavy, red metal box was sitting on the newly repaired step. It was a toolbox, old, scuffed, but filled with high-quality, well-oiled tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a heavy-headed hammer, and a voltage meter. It was a peace offering. It was permission. With the owner's unspoken approval, Jack turned his attention to the most critical vulnerability he'd identified. The security camera mounted high in the corner of the back porch. The device was a grimy, rust-covered relic. Its wire had been severed years ago, likely by a storm or a previous act of vandalism. To anyone else, it was junk. To Jack, it was a blind spot in the perimeter. He set up the ladder he found behind the storage shed, Kodiak pacing below on guard duty. The wind was picking up, biting through his gloves, but Jack's hands were steady. He disassembled the housing, cleaning out a bird's nest and the corrosion on the contact points. It was a self-contained unit, the kind that didn't require a complex internet connection, which was good because the diner's Wi-Fi barely reached the kitchen. He stripped the frayed ends of the power cable, splicing them with a spare length of wire he'd sourced, sealing the connection with electrical tape to make it weatherproof. The internal battery was dead, but the direct power line, once reconnected to the junction box, came to life. The camera's small red LED blinked on, a single eye opening in the darkness. But a live feed wasn't enough. He needed a record. Jack pulled a small, high-capacity SD card from his pocket, one he'd bought at a general store 2 towns over to avoid local questions. He slotted it into the camera's local storage port. He adjusted the angle precisely, making sure it covered the entire back entrance, the dumpsters, and the approach from the alley. It wasn't just a repair. It was a tactical installation. He configured it to only overwrite old footage when full, ensuring a continuous loop of evidence. As he climbed down the ladder, wiping grease from his hands, Jack looked up at the blinking red light. It was invisible to the casual eye, hidden in the shadows of the eaves. But to him, it was insurance. He didn't know what kind of threat could come to a place like Blackwood, but experience had taught him that the world was never as safe as it looked. He patted Kodiak's flank, and the dog leaned against him. The perimeter was secure, or at least, as secure as one man and one dog could make it. The thunderstorm hit Blackwood not as a gradual buildup, but as a sudden, violent erasure of the world. By early evening, the horizon had vanished behind a curtain of torrential rain, and the wind howled through the flatlands with a ferocity that rattled the bones of the old buildings on Main Street. The temperature plummeted, turning the air to ice, and then, inevitably, the power grid surrendered. One moment, the warm yellow glow of streetlights and living room windows held back the night. The next, the town was plunged into a profound darkness, broken only by the headlights of the few unlucky cars still struggling on the roads. Inside the Crossroads Diner, Grace Holloway stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, a dish rag clutched in her hand. The sudden silence of the humming refrigerators and ventilation fans was more alarming than the storm outside. She was alone. Brenda had left an hour ago to secure her own home, warning Grace to lock up early. Now Grace fumbled for her phone, using its pale flashlight beam to navigate the familiar maze of stainless steel tables, her heartbeat spiking as the wind slammed a loose shutter against the side of the building like a fist demanding entry. A few hundred yards down the unpaved service road that ran behind the commercial strip, a lifted pickup truck spun its wheels uselessly in a mud patch that was deepening with unnatural speed. Inside were 3 local youths who represented the town's restless and privileged underbelly. In the driver's seat was Cody Fletcher, 19, son of the town's wealthiest real estate developer. Cody was handsome in a sharp, arrogant way, wearing a varsity jacket that was no match for the weather. His face was flushed with the artificial courage of cheap whiskey. Beside him was Kevin, a skinny, nervous kid who echoed everything Cody said. And in the back was Jenna, a quiet girl who just wanted to go home. "We're stuck," Kevin stammered, staring at the wall of water outside. "My dad's gonna kill me." Cody slammed his fist on the steering wheel. "Relax. We just gotta wait it out or find a place to crash." He squinted through the windshield and saw the faint outline of the diner's back entrance. The Crossroads. It's dark. Power's out. Bet old lady Kowalski keeps a bottle of something strong in the office, and it's sure as hell warmer than this truck. The logic was flawed. Born of intoxication and entitlement. The belief that the town and everything in it existed for their convenience. They weren't hardened criminals, just bored, reckless kids who'd never been told no. They stumbled from the truck, the wind nearly knocking them over, and waded through ankle-deep water toward the back porch of the diner. In the farmhouse on the edge of the woods, the storm was a roar, but it was the silence of his dog that alerted Jack. Kodiak had been sleeping by the wood stove, but he was suddenly awake, head up, ears swiveling toward the window. He rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It wasn't an aggressive growl, but a warning. Jack, who had been reading by candlelight, watched the dog carefully. Kodiak paced to the door, whining with urgency, then looked back at Jack with an intensity that communicated a clear tactical message. Perimeter breach. Jack didn't question the dog. He grabbed his heavy coat and a flashlight, trusting Kodiak's nose more than his own senses. The wind outside carried scents Jack couldn't parse. Rain, mud, exhaust, but Kodiak smelled adrenaline, fear, and the metallic tang of aggression drifting from the direction of town. They moved out into the storm, Jack struggling for footing while Kodiak cut through the deluge like a wolf, pulling on an invisible tether, leading Jack straight for the diner. Back at the diner, Grace screamed as the glass on the back door shattered. Cody had tried the handle, found it locked, and in a fit of drunken impatience, used a tire iron from his truck to smash the pane. "It's an emergency," Cody yelled over the wind, reaching in to undo the deadbolt. "We're freezing out here." He shoved the door open, stumbling into the kitchen with Kevin and Jenna close behind. Grace backed away, dropping her phone, its flashlight beam spinning wildly across the ceiling. "Get out," she cried, her voice trembling. "I'm calling the police." Cody laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He didn't mean to hurt her, not really. But the fear in her eyes made him feel powerful, a feeling he chased to mask his own insecurities. "Relax, Grace. We just want to warm up. Maybe a free drink." He took a step toward her, looming in the darkness, his presence menacing in the confined space. Kevin was already rummaging in the pantry, knocking cans to the floor. "Cody, maybe we should go," Jenna whispered. But Cody ignored her, reaching for Grace's arm to stop her from backing away further. "Don't be like that, Grace." The back door exploded inward. It wasn't the wind. A blur of black and tan launched through the opening with the force of a missile. Kodiak didn't bark. He wasted no energy. He slammed directly into Cody's chest, the impact lifting the bigger boy off his feet and knocking him flat on the cold tile floor. Cody cried out, instinctively bringing his arms up to protect his throat. Kodiak's jaws clamped down on Cody's forearm, a controlled, crushing bite designed to incapacitate, not to kill. The sound of the bite, a wet, sickening crunch, was audible even over the storm. Cody screamed in pain, the tire iron clattering to the floor. Kevin scrambled backward, tripping over a crate of onions and sprawling on his back, while Jenna shrieked and pressed herself against the wall. Jack stepped over the threshold a second later, his flashlight beam cutting through the chaos like a sword of light. He took in the scene instantly. The broken glass, the terrified waitress, the intruders. Kodiak. Jack's command was a whip crack in the dark. The dog released Cody immediately but remained standing over him, hackles raised, teeth bared, a low, terrifying growl issuing from his throat. Cody cradled his bleeding arm, sobbing. "He bit me. He's crazy. Get him off me." Jack moved to Grace first, putting himself between her and the intruders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and even. She shook her head, unable to speak, her hands clutching his jacket. Jack swept the flashlight beam over the three intruders. "You broke in?" he stated flatly. We were just cold," Kevin stammered from the floor, his face ashen. "We wanted shelter and that beast attacked us." Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the wind. Someone, a neighbor who heard the glass break or saw the lights, had made the call. When Deputy Miller, Cody's uncle, and Sheriff Thompson kicked in the front door minutes later, flashlights blazing, the scene had shifted. Cody was being helped up by Jenna, blood dripping from his arm onto the pristine floor. "Thank God," Cody yelled, pointing a trembling, blood-smeared finger at Jack. "Sheriff, arrest him. We came in for help 'cause our truck broke down and that psycho set his wolf on us. I think he was waiting for us." The sheriff, a large man with a weary face, looked from his deputy's bleeding nephew to the shattered back door, and then to Jack, who stood stoically with the massive dog at his heel. The story had been written. To the sheriff, it looked like three scared local kids and a violent drifter with a dangerous weapon. "Jack Callahan," the sheriff said, his hand resting on his sidearm. Get control of your animal. And step away from the girl. The storm had passed, leaving Blackwood buried under a layer of mud and glistening, clean-washed air. But the quiet was a deception. While the winds had died down, a different kind of storm was brewing in the coffee shops and on the swept sidewalks of Main Street. By 8:00 a.m., the story of what happened at the Crossroads Diner had morphed, twisted from a tale of self-defense into a horror story of unprovoked aggression. Cody Fletcher, sporting a dramatic arm bandage and a well-practiced victim's face, held court in the local general store, recounting how he and his friends had narrowly escaped a deranged hermit and his wolf hybrid while seeking shelter from the storm. His father, Harrison Fletcher, a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, was at the sheriff's station, his voice booming through the thin walls, demanding justice, an immediate jail sentence, and the destruction of the dangerous animal that had mauled his son. Harrison was a big man, soft in the middle but hard in the eyes, usually seen in tailored sports coats that cost more than most people's cars, and he viewed the town not as a community, but as a portfolio of assets he managed. Sheriff Thompson, looking more tired than usual, rubbed his temples as he listened to Harrison threaten to call the governor if that maniac wasn't behind bars by noon. The pressure was a physical weight. In a small town, the truth often mattered less than who was shouting the loudest. And Harrison Fletcher had the loudest voice in the valley. Jack Callahan was back at the diner, not to eat, but to repair the door that had been broken. He moved with mechanical precision, sweeping up shards of glass that glittered like diamonds in the morning sun, his face an unreadable mask. Grace worked beside him, her eyes red from a lack of sleep and from crying. She had tried to tell the deputy what had really happened, but he dismissed her testimony as hysteria, or implied that she was covering for her boyfriend, a suggestion that made her blood boil. Kodiak sat in the corner of the kitchen, calm and alert, his ear twitching at every sound from the street. The air in the diner was thick with unspoken fear. When the sirens cut through the morning silence, they didn't sound like help. They sounded like a gavel falling. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, followed by an animal control vehicle, a white box truck with barred windows that looked disturbingly like a mobile prison. A small crowd of onlookers, fueled by the morning's gossip, gathered on the sidewalk, their whispers turning into a collective gasp as Sheriff Thompson emerged, flanked by his deputies and a self-satisfied-looking Harrison Fletcher. Jack set the broom down and wiped his hands on a rag, slowly stepping out onto the front porch. Kodiak followed, glued to his left heel. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a sentry holding a position. Sheriff Thompson walked up the steps, his hand resting on his belt, not drawn, but clearly ready. Jack Callahan, Thompson said, his voice pitched for the benefit of the crowd. I have a warrant for your arrest for assault with a dangerous weapon and reckless endangerment. And I have a court order to seize the animal known as Kodiak for quarantine and behavioral assessment. Grace burst through the door, her apron flying in the cool breeze. You can't do this. She cried, her voice breaking. They broke in. Kodiak was protecting me. Cody is lying. Harrison Fletcher strode forward, sneering. Give it up, sweetheart. My son has 40 stitches in his arm because this lunatic trained a wolf to hunt people. That beast is getting put down before it kills a child. The crowd murmured in agreement, fear overwhelming logic. An animal control officer, a nervous young man with a catch pole, advanced toward the stairs. Kodiak let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the wooden porch, causing the officer to freeze. Jack placed a hand on Kodiak's head, and the growl instantly ceased. He looked at the catch pole, then at Harrison Fletcher, and finally, directly into Sheriff Thompson's eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He spoke with an absolute, bone-chilling calm that cut through the crowd's noise like a razor. Sheriff, before you take another step, you need to understand exactly what you're doing. Jack said, this is not a pet. This is retired military working dog Kodiak, service number K9451. He is a decorated veteran who saved 12 Marines in Fallujah. He is considered legal military property on detached retirement status. Jack took a step forward, his posture shifting from defensive to commanding. If you seize him, you are responsible for his welfare. If you harm him, if you put him down without a federal hearing, you will not just be facing a dog bite case. You will be answering to the Department of the Navy and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I will bury this town in so much federal litigation you won't be able to afford a stop sign. The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison Fletcher's face turned purple, but for the first time, he looked unsure. The sheriff blinked, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. This wasn't a drifter spouting nonsense. This was a soldier giving a tactical warning. I'm following the law, Callahan, Thompson said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. The judge signed the order. The dog goes into quarantine. You're coming to the station. If what you say is true, you can prove it in court, but for now, you need to surrender. He motioned to the deputies. Don't make this ugly. Jack looked down at Kodiak. The dog looked up, his amber eyes trusting, waiting for the command to attack or to stand down. It was the hardest decision Jack had made since he left the desert. If he fought, they would shoot the dog. If he surrendered, he lost control. He took a deep breath of the cool air, and made his choice. Stay, Kodiak, he whispered, his voice catching with emotion. Stay. He looked at the animal control officer. No pole. He walks with me to the truck. Jack led Kodiak to the cage himself, the crowd parting as if they were radioactive. He gave the dog the signal to kennel. Kodiak hesitated, whining once, a soft cry of confusion that broke Grace's heart before he obeyed the hand signal. The metal door slammed shut, a sound of finality. Jack turned back and offered his wrists to the sheriff. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Grace stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face, watching the only two beings who had made her feel safe be dragged away by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The silence in Blackwood that night was heavy, a suffocating cold blanket that seemed to trap the truth beneath layers of mud and apathy. Grace Holloway sat at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the empty chair where her cat usually slept. The image of Jack being led away in handcuffs and the confused, heartbroken whine from Kodiak as the cage door slammed shut played on a loop in her mind, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She felt small, powerless against the crushing weight of the Fletcher family's influence and the town's rush to judgment. They had already convicted Jack in the court of public opinion, painting him as an unstable drifter and Kodiak as a ticking time bomb. But Grace knew what she had seen. She knew the terror of that night, the way Cody's eyes had looked, not scared, but predatory. And she knew that Kodiak hadn't attacked a helpless boy. He had stopped a monster. Despair threatened to swallow her until a flicker of memory cut through the darkness. She remembered the nights Jack had spent working in the alley, the quiet scrape of tools, and the image of him high on a ladder, fiddling with the rusty metal box under the eaves. She remembered a small, blinking red light she had noticed one evening while taking out the trash, a light that hadn't been there before. A camera. Adrenaline surged through her, chasing away the fatigue. If Jack had fixed that camera, if it had been recording, it would have captured everything. The break-in, the threats, the truth. But the town's power grid was still spotty, flickering on and off, and the internet lines were down from the storm. There was no way to check a cloud feed, even if she had a password. She needed the physical memory, the card inside the device itself. Without a second thought, she grabbed her coat and boots, armed with a flashlight. The journey to the diner was treacherous. The roads were slick sheets of black ice hidden under fresh mud. The wind bit at her exposed face, but she pushed onward, driven by a desperate need to fix the mess her powerlessness had allowed to happen. When she reached the Crossroads Diner, the building stood dark and silent, a ghost ship in the night. She went around to the back alley, the crime scene still cordoned off with yellow police tape that fluttered in the wind. She ducked underneath, her flashlight beam dancing over the shards of broken glass that still littered the porch. The camera was there, high on the corner of the wall, a dark shape against the peeling white paint. It was too high to reach. Grace dragged the heavy aluminum ladder from the storage shed, her boot slipping on the icy concrete. The metal was frigid, biting at her gloves as she wrestled it into place against the wall. The ground was uneven, covered in frozen slush, and the ladder wobbled precariously as she put her foot on the first rung. She looked up. It was a long way down, and the wind was picking up again, threatening to push her over. She took a breath, gripped the rungs, and started to climb. Every step was a battle against gravity and fear. The ladder groaned under her weight, shifting slightly on the ice. Halfway up, a gust of wind slammed into her, and she gasped, clinging to the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Don't look down, Grace," she whispered to herself. "Just get the card." She reached the top, her fingers fumbling with the camera's housing. It was stiff with cold, the screws frozen in place. She used a quarter from her pocket as a makeshift screwdriver, chipping away at the ice, panic rising in her throat as the ladder slid an inch to the right. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness below, blinding her. "You're going to break your neck, girl." A gruff voice called up from the ground. Grace froze, terrified of being caught by Deputy Miller or someone worse. She looked down, shielding her eyes. Standing at the base of the ladder, wearing a thick wool coat over her nightgown and heavy rubber boots, was Brenda Kowalski. The older woman didn't look angry. She looked tired, her face etched with the same worry that was eating away at Grace. Brenda didn't yell. She didn't order Grace down. Instead, she strode forward, planted her boots firmly in the slush, and gripped the legs of the ladder with both gloved hands. "Well, come on," Brenda snapped, her breath puffing in the air. "Don't just hang there like a frozen bat. Get the damn thing before the wind takes us both. I've got you." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she nodded, turning back to the camera. With Brenda holding the base, the wobble stopped. Grace managed to pry the housing open. There, nestled in its slot, was a small black SD card. It looked insignificant, a tiny piece of plastic, but it held 2 lives in its circuits. She popped it out, clutched it in her gloved hand, and scrambled down the ladder as fast as she could. Once on solid ground, Grace slumped against the brick wall, trembling with adrenaline. Brenda let go of the ladder and looked at the girl, her expression softening. "You think he recorded it?" she asked gruffly. "He records everything," Grace said, holding up the card. "He's a soldier." Brenda nodded. "My office. Generators running in the back room. Let's see what those little monsters really did." They went inside, locking the door behind them. The office was cramped, smelling of old invoices and peppermints. Brenda fired up her ancient desktop computer, the fan whirring loudly in the quiet room. Grace plugged the card into a reader, her hand hovering over the mouse. She clicked on the file dated from the day before. The video player opened, grainy black and white footage filling the screen. It was silent, but the images were sharp. They watched Cody, Kevin, and Jenna stumble toward the door. They watched Cody try the handle, then smash the glass with the tire iron, breaking and entering, clear as day. They watched them stagger into the kitchen. And then the moment that changed everything. The footage showed Cody cornering Grace near the pantry. It showed him reach into his jacket pocket and pull out not a phone, not a flask, but a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. He waved it in front of Grace, laughing, the weapon glinting in the camera's dim infrared light. The threat was undeniable. It wasn't a plea for shelter. It was an armed assault. Then came the blur of Kodiak launching into the frame. The dog didn't attack indiscriminately. It targeted the weapon arm. The bite was precise, surgical, neutralizing the threat instantly. Cody dropped the knife, screaming silently on the screen. Jack appeared seconds later, securing the scene. Brenda let out a long, low whistle. "That boy didn't just break in," she muttered, her eyes hard as flint. "He tried to assault you with a deadly weapon. And that dog saved your life." Grace sobbed, a mixture of relief and horror washing over her. They had the proof. They had the knife. And tomorrow morning, the town of Blackwood was going to have a reckoning. The Blackwood Town Hall was a building that smelled of floor wax and old bureaucracy, a place where zoning disputes and budget committees usually sucked the oxygen out of the room. But tonight, the air was charged with a mob mentality that felt more like a witch hunt than a civic gathering. Every seat was filled and people stood along the back walls, their faces flushed with the righteous indignation stoked by Harrison Fletcher. At the front of the room, behind a long oak table, sat the town council, looking uncomfortable under the glare of their constituents. To the side, seated in a metal folding chair with his hands cuffed in front of him, was Jack Callahan. He sat with a stillness that was unnerving to those who watched him, his back straight, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, ignoring the whispers and the hostile glares. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a granite statue, weathering a storm without flinching. Harrison Fletcher was at the podium, his voice booming as he gestured wildly toward Jack. "We cannot allow this menace to exist in our community," Harrison bellowed, sweat beading on his brow under the lights. "My son is in the hospital because this man brought a weapon of war into our town, a dangerous, untrained animal that mauled a boy seeking shelter. We need to sign this expulsion order immediately and ensure that animal is destroyed before it kills again." The crowd murmured in agreement, a low, ugly sound of fear masquerading as justice. Just as the mayor reached for his gavel to bring the motion to a vote, the double doors at the back of the hall flew open. The sound was like a gunshot, silencing the room instantly. Grace May stood there, breathless, her hair a mess and her coat damp with dew. Beside her stood Brenda Kowalski, clutching a laptop like a shield. "Stop!" Grace yelled, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry to the rafters. "You're lying. All of you are lying." Harrison Fletcher sneered, leaning into the microphone. "Somebody get this hysterical girl out of here. This is official business." But Grace didn't back down. She marched down the center aisle, her boots thudding on the hardwood floor, ignoring the hands that reached out to stop her. "I have proof," she said, looking the mayor straight in the eye. "We have the security footage from the diner. Jack didn't attack anyone. Kodiak didn't attack anyone. They saved my life." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. The mayor, a cautious man who disliked Harrison Fletcher's bullying tactics, lowered his gavel. "If there is evidence, we will hear it," he ruled. Brenda stepped forward, plugging a cable into the side of her laptop and connecting it to the projector system used for budget slideshows. The screen behind the council table flickered to life. The room was dead silent as the grainy, black and white video began to play. They saw the storm. They saw Cody Fletcher, clearly visible, smashing the glass door. They saw the group stagger inside. And then a collective gasp sucked the air out of the room as Cody pulled the hunting knife from his jacket. On the large screen, the weapon looked enormous, the intent unmistakable. This wasn't a scared boy looking for warmth. This was an armed assailant cornering a lone woman. When Kodiak flew into the frame, the context was entirely different. It wasn't an attack. It was a rescue. The precision of the dog, the way it targeted the weapon arm, the way it released on command, it was professional, not feral. The video ended, frozen on the image of Jack standing over the intruder, protective and in control. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Harrison Fletcher stood at the podium, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He had no excuse. The lie had been stripped bare for the entire town to see. Before the whispers could turn into a roar of outrage against Fletcher, Sheriff Thompson rose from his seat near Jack. The sheriff had been silent all evening, holding a thick manila folder he'd received by fax just an hour before. He walked to the center of the room, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet. He didn't look at Harrison. He looked at the people of his town, his expression grim. "I've heard a lot of talk tonight about drifters, and vagrants, and dangerous men," Thompson said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "So I decided to do my job. I ran Jack Callahan's prints through the federal database this afternoon. Took a while to get clearance because his file is flagged at the highest security level." He opened the folder, pulling out a sheet of paper. "This man is not a drifter. He is Commander Jack Callahan, United States Navy SEALs." A wave of shock rolled through the room. Thompson continued, reading from the file. "Commander Callahan has served 6 combat tours. He is the recipient of the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat." Thompson looked up, his eyes sweeping the room, stopping hard on the faces of those who had hurled insults at Jack just minutes before. The Navy Cross is the second highest military medal this country awards. He earned it by holding a position alone for 12 hours against an enemy force of over 100, refusing evacuation until every one of his men was safe. Thompson turned to Jack. The sheriff, a Gulf War veteran himself who had seen enough to know the cost of that kind of heroism, squared his shoulders. He walked to the folding chair. With deliberate slowness, he pulled the key from his belt and unlocked the handcuffs. The metal clattered to the floor. Thompson didn't step back. Instead, he snapped to attention, rendering a crisp, formal salute. "Commander," Thompson said, his voice thick with respect. "I am sorry. This town is sorry." Jack slowly got to his feet, rubbing his wrists. He looked at the sheriff, then at the silent crowd. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. He returned the salute, a simple, clean gesture. "I just want my dog, Sheriff," Jack said quietly. The shame in the room was palpable. Men looked down at their shoes. Women covered their mouths. They had judged a hero as a villain, and the weight of their prejudice hung in the air. The mayor banged his gavel, but gently this time. "Charges dismissed," he said, his voice shaky. "Release the dog immediately. And Mr. Fletcher, sit down." The door to a side office opened, and a deputy led Kodiak out. The dog wasn't aggressive. He was scanning the room, searching. When he saw Jack, he let out a single bark of pure joy, straining against the leash. Jack dropped to one knee, ignoring the crowd, ignoring the politics, ignoring the tears on Grace's face. He opened his arms, and 80 pounds of German Shepherd launched into them, licking his face, whining, burying his head in Jack's chest. Jack buried his face in the dog's fur, his shoulders shaking slightly. It was a reunion of 2 soldiers who had been to hell and back, finding their only peace in each other. Grace watched them, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and pride, knowing that Blackwood would never be the same. They had tried to break a man made of steel, but in the end, it was their own hardness that had shattered, revealing the truth underneath. The last of the season's mud had finally begun to dry, revealing the sleeping brown earth of Blackwood beneath its heavy winter coat. It had been 3 weeks since the town hall meeting, and the atmosphere in the valley had shifted as profoundly as the season. The suspicion that once followed Jack Callahan like a shadow had evaporated, replaced by an awkward, often overwhelming, gratitude. People who used to cross the street to avoid him now waved from their porches or stopped to shake his hand at the grocery store. The for sale sign on the old Miller property, a dilapidated 60-acre farmstead just 2 miles from the Crossroads Diner, had been rusting for a decade. The barn listed dangerously to the left. The fences were rotted through, and the main house was a skeleton of peeling paint and broken windows. To anyone else, it was a money pit. To Jack, it looked like a second chance. He stood by the gate, the deed in his jacket pocket, looking out over the overgrown fields. He hadn't planned to stay. The plan had been to drift, to keep moving until the noise in his head quieted down. But as he looked down at Kodiak, who was happily sniffing a patch of thawing mud, Jack realized the noise had stopped. It wasn't the silence of emptiness anymore. It was the quiet of peace. He wasn't running. For the first time in years, he was putting down roots. The renovation of the Miller farm became a community project, though Jack never asked for help. It started with Brenda Kowalski showing up one morning with a truckload of lumber and her 2 grandsons, burly men who knew their way around a roof. "Can't have a Navy commander living in a drafty house," she'd grumbled, handing him a hammer. Then it was the local carpenter who'd been in the back of the room at the town hall meeting offering to fix the barn doors for the cost of materials. Even Sheriff Thompson came by on his days off, trading his badge for a tool belt to help mend the perimeter fence. Jack accepted the help, not with pride, but with a quiet, humble understanding that this was their way of making amends. He wasn't just rebuilding a farm. He was rebuilding his faith in humanity, one nail at a time. The project had given him a purpose beyond mere survival. He envisioned the farm as more than a home, but as a sanctuary. He knew there were others like him, men and women who had come back from the desert with their bodies intact, but their souls frayed at the edges. Warriors who didn't fit into the neat square holes of civilian life. He had the space. He had the experience. And he had the ultimate therapeutic tool, dogs. By late spring, the Warrior and K9 Reintegration Center was open. It wasn't a clinical facility with white walls and fluorescent lights. It was a place of dirt and sweat and wood smoke. The first group of veterans arrived in May, a mix of Rangers, Marines, and regular infantry, all carrying the invisible rucksacks of trauma. They were wary at first, their eyes scanning the perimeter for threats just as Jack's had. But then they met Kodiak. The big German Shepherd had become the center's unofficial mascot and lead therapist. He seemed to sense instinctively who was having a bad day, resting his heavy head on a trembling knee or simply sitting in silent companionship next to a man staring at nothing. Jack taught them how to train dogs, how to channel their hypervigilance into focus, how to communicate without yelling. He taught them that a dog didn't care about their rank or their nightmares. A dog only cared about the present moment. Watching a former sniper smile for the first time in months while playing fetch with a rescue Labrador, Jack felt a knot in his own chest loosen that he hadn't even realized was there. Grace Holloway became the heartbeat of the operation. She still worked shifts at the diner during the week, but every weekend, her little car came crunching up the gravel driveway. She wasn't military, but she possessed a different kind of strength, a cheerful, relentless resilience that softened the farm's hard edges. She took over the office, organizing the chaos of paperwork, coordinating with veterans' charities, and managing schedules. She brought color to the place, planting wildflowers along the fence line and hanging curtains in the main house. She became the bridge between the soldiers and the world they had fought to protect. One Saturday afternoon, she found Jack in the barn sanding down an old desk. He stopped as he saw her, wiping sawdust from his forehead. "You don't have to spend your weekends here," he said, though the thought of her not being there made the barn feel empty. Grace picked up a piece of sandpaper. "I know," she said simply. "But Kodiak misses me. And besides, someone has to make sure you actually eat lunch." She smiled, and it was the same smile that had greeted a scary dog in a dark alley months ago, full of unreserved kindness. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she had saved him just as much as Kodiak had. The culmination of their journey came not with a bang or a ceremony, but in a quiet moment that felt like a benediction. It was early fall, and the air had that crisp, nostalgic chill that signaled winter's return. Jack woke before dawn, a habit he would never break. But this time, he wasn't waking to the memory of combat. He put on a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the farm's renovated kitchen. He poured 2 mugs and stepped out onto the wide porch he'd finished the week before. Kodiak padded after him, his claws clicking softly on the new wood, and lay down on a rug near the rocking chairs. The sky was a canvas of deep indigo, fading to violet and gold as the sun began to edge over the jagged peaks of the distant hills. Snow had dusted the high country overnight, painting them a brilliant white against the morning sky. The screen door creaked and Grace stepped out, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, holding her own mug. She didn't say anything, just came to stand beside him, leaning against the rail. They watched the light spill into the valley, illuminating the training yards, the repaired barn, and the smoke curling from the chimney of the guest cabin, where 3 veterans slept soundly. It was a kingdom of things that had been broken but were mended strong. Jack took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at Kodiak, sleeping peacefully with his belly exposed, a sign of absolute security. He looked at Grace, her face bathed in the golden light of the sunrise, her eyes calm and happy. He looked at the town of Blackwood in the distance, no longer a hostile territory, but a community he was a part of. The isolation that had defined his existence for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging that was both terrifying and wonderful. "It's a good morning," Grace whispered, her voice husky with sleep. Jack reached over and placed his hand over hers on the railing. His was rough, scarred, and calloused. Hers was smaller, softer, but just as steady. "Yeah," Jack replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "It is." He took a deep breath of the cool, clean air. "I used to think I left home overseas," he said, his gaze on the horizon. "But I think I was just waiting to build this one." Kodiak let out a contented sigh in his sleep, his tail giving a single, lazy thump against the floorboards. The soldier, the girl, and the dog stood together in the quiet light of a new day. Finally home.